finishing off with Richard, I just want to have a quick look at some of the questions that have come up in the past and just think about what sort of things Richard would feature in terms of how you would answer a question about Richard on that question. So the specimen paper said tragedies leave readers and audiences with a final sense of emptiness and disillusion. And that would be going very well for Richard. Obviously, you can look at the ending of the play there, the death of Richard, and that final scene in 5/6. And disillusion would be the key there. That suggests that there were illusions, and so it would do well to trace the idea that in the first half of the play there's some hope that Bolingbroke is a good alternative to Richard, but by the end of the play he seems to be worse, if anything. So you can see how that would go well. At the heart of the tragic experience is overwhelming sense of shame. That's a harder one to tie into Richard, and I think it would just be obvious that you would have done the first one there, but you could do the second one too, in the sense of you could look at the two scenes of abdication in 3/3 and Act 4, and then in the final scene of Richard's in 5/5, and look at the sense that what's driving him, to some extent at least, is his shame at being overthrown. But again, you can see that certain scenes already are appearing more than once there. 2017 was the first actual paper, and that is suffering experienced by tragic protagonists always evokes pity in readers and audiences. Now, always is the word that they put in that they want you to argue with. Pity is a really good word for Richard, but it's pity in the sense that he self-pities, and that that's the strongest emotion in the play, perhaps, is his self-pity, particularly again in 5/5, but also in Act 4. And the other one, moments of happiness in tragedies are rare. Their only purpose is to heighten the tragic outcome. Again, with Richard, that was harder to trace any real happiness in the play there. You could say, ironically, he's happy when Gaunt dies, but of course that is very much a black mark against him in terms of the way he behaves towards his uncle at his death. But then, of course, you could look at that key scene 3/2, where his happiness comes and goes rapidly. So again, that's another scene I think that we'll find will be useful in quite a few of the questions. If we look at 2018, you can see villains and antagonists in tragedies are wickedly attractive. That one does not work very well for Richard, unless you argue that actually, in a way, Richard himself is the villain and the antagonist, and he does have a certain wicked attractiveness. His humour in the death of Gaunt could be kind of something that we find ourselves participating in and finding amusing. His attitude in 1/4 and 2/1 in particular there, and then the way in which he torments Bolingbroke in Act 4. No, it's Act 4 again coming up. So you have to twist the question a little bit sometimes, just be aware of that. The pride displayed by tragic heroes and tragic heroines elevates them rather than diminishes them. So pride obviously is a big driver of Richard's personality. Does it elevate him or diminish him? It's his problem, and I don't think it particularly elevates him. In fact, he remains proud in Act 4 again, and perhaps in 5/5 at the end. There's a certain sense of his own self-worth there, but it's an illusion, and it's the driver to his tragedy. So I think you'd probably argue against that. Remember, do feel that you can take on the statements and disagree. At the end of tragic texts, positives always emerge. Again, you could nicely argue about the historical treatment of the play there and talk about how a lot of early productions and critics seem to suggest that it was rather positive that Bolingbroke took over, but that we as modern readers see something brutal, dictatorial, and also rather feeble in his efforts in the second half of the play. So again, guess what? We've got Act 4, we've got 5/6. Those two scenes would be central to that probably. Again, at the end helps us because we could always look at 5/5 there too. In tragic text, protagonists are exceptional characters who fall from good fortune to misery. Well, clearly that's what happens to Richard, and he is exceptional in a way that perhaps makes him not a very good king, but he is exceptional. He's a poet king. 2020, tragic protagonists are flawed, but they are redeemed by the love and care they show for others. Well, there's a problem with that with Richard in that he is not very loving and caring in the first half of the play, but there is that scene with the Queen in Act 5, Scene 1, which does show some compassion for her, and that perhaps does redeem him somewhat, although he would often say that it's his self-absorption that's the problem. And again, Act 4 there, the looking in the mirror sort of is the symbolic moment of him very much concerned about himself and observing his own downfall and pitying himself. In tragic literature, when characters die, their deaths are always met with sadness. Well, again, we could highlight straight away, again, a key scene coming up again, 2-1, the death of Gaunt. It's the fact that it isn't met with sadness in 1-4 and 2-1 is part of the thing that drives the tragedy, because it's the big mistake that Richard makes. There's other deaths in the play, but of course we then look at Richard's own death and wonder how far we find it sad. Of course, Bolingbroke himself finds it sad, because it says they're always met with sadness. That doesn't necessarily have to mean the audience, it could mean the characters as well. So I think there's plenty in that. And again, what key scenes are coming up? Well, 2-1 and 5-5 and 5-6. Mistakes made by tragic protagonists always have terrible consequences for those around them. I think that would be the Queen question really for us. So it might be worth knowing those Queen scenes, although I think that's a bit of a stretch in some ways in terms of trying to keep your revision containable. You might not particularly want to spend time looking at those 3 scenes in which the Queen appears. 2-1, 2-2, where she's in 2-1 briefly, 2-2 particularly, and 3-4, and then obviously 5-1. In tragedy, order is disrupted and never restored. Well, yeah, I think there's certainly plenty in Richard there where things fall apart, don't they? And of course, when Bolingbroke comes to power, that order is not restored, with the gauges in Act 4 and the beheadings in 5-6, suggesting that chaos is continuing. In tragic texts, although villains are far from good, they are not evil. Again, the question with Richard is who's the villain? But that will be an interesting thing to debate. And I'd often fall back, again, thinking a little bit outside the box, fall back on the fact that Richard might be the villain. Explore the significance of places. And again, that might initially make you anxious, but the place of the court, which will be Act 1, Scene 1, Act 4, and Act 5, Scene 6. Look at those 3 scenes, and you've got a different, very different order of events there happening in those 3 scenes. Or you could look in 5-5 and the prison cell, which is a big contrast to the first scene. Tragic heroes begin with power, then lose it. But yeah, the only problem there is making any sort of argument, really. And I suppose with Richard, the argument is how much power did he really have? He appears to have power, but probably doesn't really have much. Explore the significance, they're liking those questions more and more now, of nature and the natural. That's quite a challenging one. But remember, he appears on the beach in 3-2, so that's nature. And he talks in that scene about how the natural world is on his side, that poisonous toads and nettles and things are going to impede Bolingbroke's progress. So there is something in there, but I think that's quite a tricky one. And then 2024, tragic texts, although happiness never lasts, its joy and intensity of enduring value. Again, that seems to me to be a very challenging question for Richard. I'm not sure where the happiness that they're trying to get us to focus on really appears in Richard, who is happy. You could sort of say that he's reasonably happy at the start of the play and maybe in 1-3 when he seems to be in control. He's definitely happy at the death of Gaunt, so in 1-4 and 2-1, back to those 2 scenes. So that might be interesting. And then you could maybe look at the melancholy of the Queen. Explore the significance of friends and friendship. So that one also, I think, not the easiest one for Richard initially. But when you think about it, it is Bushy, Green and Bagot, and that friendship, and Armel as well, that is the problem that Bolingbroke complains about. So you've got enough there, I think, with 1-4 and 2-1, and then the murder of Bushy and Green in 3-1, and Armel's continued loyalty, including being present in 3-3 at the scene where Richard comes down from the balcony. So There is enough in there for that, but those two questions together were quite a challenging pair for 2024. In terms of 2025, we could just quickly shift to look at that too, because I have got a copy of the 2025, but I'll have to look at my other document there, if you'll forgive the pause, which is our most recent of the exam questions, and so we can look at the last two there. So they were there, 2025. In tragic texts, families and family life are torn apart. So clearly that could to do with Bolingbroke and Gaunt, as well as Richard and his wife, or explore the significance of errors of judgment. That was a gift, because really the whole play is made up of Richard's errors of judgment, but particularly, again, guess what? 2-1. So again, same scenes coming up again and again, I think is fairly obvious from what we've said there. So that was just a quick run through of the past questions, but it just was trying to illustrate that even the difficult ones, you can think a little bit outside the box. Don't get thrown and think this is impossible. None of the questions were impossible. They all could be done for Richard. But it's very much worth you spending some time looking at those questions one by one and just thinking which scenes would I use for that question, and that will guide your revision further.